There is a garden, there is a city, and there's a kingdom of God. And it is beautiful, and He is bringing it right now into our midst. Welcome, everybody. Glad to have you here on week number 2 of our leadership series on Lead, Love, and Serve the Jesus Way. I'd like to welcome those of you who are watching by live stream, and also welcome to those who might be over at the Life Center for our 3rd service. So week number 2 of having conversations about leadership. And it doesn't take you very long to realize that there's always conversations going on about leadership. A lot of times it's going on about bad leadership. And so the last couple of weeks, one of the leaders who have been in the news quite a bit is Urban Meyer, who was the still but maybe soon to be former head football coach for Ohio State University. And boy, a lot of stuff's been going on there. And not only is he affected, but the entire university is going to wind up being affected by the decision that they make. It's a little bit reminiscent of a much more serious case years ago with Sandusky, and how the entire Penn State University system was drastically affected by the leadership failure of an individual. But for me, a lot more disturbing was the fact that this past week, Monday morning, New York Times had as their, after they talked about the earthquake in Indonesia, right down below, they had a lead article, huge then inside page full of it, about the leadership failures and accusations, allegations against Bill Hybels, who is the founder of Willow Creek Community Church, one of the great mega churches of the world. They have done incalculable good for so many nations in terms of their leadership development. And here their founding but now retired lead pastor is facing a lot of allegations. Now, if that wasn't difficult enough, on Monday, the teaching pastor who was the successor to Bill Hybels, he wound up announcing that he was resigning because he was so discouraged by how the church leadership had handled all of the allegations. And then by the end of the week, the female who was the lead executive pastor of Willow Creek, she also resigned for the same reason. And the entire board of elders resigned because they felt that they had been inadequate, made some significant mistakes in handling all these issues going on. And so not only is there a leader who has done some bad leadership, but an entire organization has been affected by this bad leadership. And that kind of stuff just goes on all the time. That's what we are talking about today. Today's going to be kind of the bad news about what's gone wrong with leadership. Before we get there, last week we talked about, in the beginning, it was very, very good. We looked at Genesis 1 and 2, and we did that through the lens of the Psalms, and we saw how God had designed leadership to be something very beautiful and significant. We saw that leadership is really the use of power and authority. Power means you have the ability to do something. Authority means you have the right or position to exercise your power. Put them together, and that is the essence of all leadership. Now, all power and authority, all leadership is connected to a source, it's got a nature, and it has a purpose. And we really spent the rest of the morning talking about good leadership exists for the flourishing of the world, and especially the people that are loved. The nature of such leadership is love and service on behalf of others, and the reason it can be that way is it is plugged into God, the creator, the maker of heaven and earth, the God of grace and love and mercy and all good things. So this is good leadership. Now, today we are looking at bad leadership, and we're going to look at this first. By the way, I came across this quote. Whoever connects me with the hidden springs of all life, whoever increases the sense of life in me, that person is my leader. Mary Parker Follett. Mary Parker Follett was a social worker, a philosopher, an organizational consultant. She was actually she's called the founding mother of organizational theory, and she was an advisor for President Teddy Roosevelt. Gives you a sense of how far back this was, and she was just far, far ahead of her day. And Roosevelt had her as a consultant for how to handle nonprofits and NGOs, and she was the one who really understood leadership is those people who help us connect with these deep, hidden springs of all life. And to be honest, that's exactly what this is all about. Mary Parker Follett had really tapped into that particular idea, and I just love that. That's what leaders do. We get people connected to life. Today, however, part 2 is leadership not the way it is supposed to be. It does not take us very, very long to notice whether it's in the home or the workplace, whether it is in the church, whether it is in school systems or government in all of its branches, legislative, judicial, and executive. Wherever you look, leaders are just not leading the way they are supposed to be. Something has gone wrong. And that indeed is my question today. I want to try and figure out what has gone wrong with leadership. What's gone wrong with power and authority that it winds up having so many negative consequences on the lives of individuals? Because we've all been affected by bad leaders. We've all been hurt by bad leadership, and maybe every now and then you and I, we have actually been bad leaders who have hurt others. So what's gone wrong that this is so prevalent? And then the second question is, what is God doing about what's gone wrong? Now, I'm only going to give you a clue at the very end of the message about what God is really doing about what's gone wrong. And then all the weeks that follow for the rest of our conversations on leadership, we are going to increasingly see what God is doing to redeem, repair, renew, restore what has gone wrong. But today is going to be a long look at what has gone wrong. And in Genesis chapter 3, very quickly, we see things go pretty bad. You know, chapter 1 and 2, it's all good. Chapter 3, it's all bad. Adam and Eve, they don't listen to God. They want to be like God. They wind up eating the apple. They cross the boundary. They transgress the limits that God had established. Right away, they become fearful and afraid. They hide. They move into denial, rationalization, justification, blame shifting. All these kinds of things happen in chapter 3. And then you get to chapter 4, and very quickly it goes from bad to worse with Cain and Abel. Cain and Abel were the sons of Adam and Eve, and Cain is jealous of his brother, envious, angry, almost in a rage, actually, because what he winds up doing is he is so competitive and so jealous of his brother that he winds up killing his brother. Cain uses power to kill his brother when he should have been his brother's keeper. He says, am I my brother's keeper? The answer is no, I'm not my brother's keeper. I'll do whatever I want to my brother. I mean, we can see how quickly things are going from bad to worse. And then at the end of the chapter, there's a guy named Lamech, and Lamech winds up saying, hey, if you thought Cain was bad, I am far, far worse. You know, somebody just looks at me the wrong way, I'm going to take vengeance upon them. To 77 times vengeance. I'm going to wind up killing somebody for even saying something not nice about me. We can just see how it's going so very bad. Well, by the time we get to Genesis chapter 6, there's a couple of verses that I think are some of the saddest verses in the Bible. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on earth. And notice there are no qualifications here. This is just absolute stark, that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. No qualification, just a stark statement. Things have gone very, very bad by the time we get to Genesis chapter 6. Now, if that verse isn't bad enough, look at what the conclusion is. Then the Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth. His heart was troubled. I mean, God, who had created humanity a little lower than the angels, crowned with dignity and glory, and invited us to be partakers of his plans to advance his will on the earth and do so much good in partnership with him, things have become so bad that God regrets that he even made us. By the end of Genesis chapter 6, the earth is in a bad condition. There's a way of life that is now already established on earth. The book of Judges at the end says there was no king in Israel and everybody did what was fit or seemed fitting or right in their own eyes. Listen, when there's no legitimate power and authority, when there's no good, healthy, flourishing leadership, then what happens is everybody becomes a king and a queen, and for everybody it's just a game of thrones that they're playing about who's going to have the power. And I intentionally use Game of Thrones because that's one of the ongoing TV series where some people have called Game of Thrones Lord of the Rings for adults. Well, I might add it's Lord of the Rings for adults who don't mind, murder and mayhem, death and destruction, and lots of other depravity thrown in. But Game of Thrones, they're just trying to say realistically, this is what happens when there's no legitimate use of power and authority. And so now what's been established is might makes right. It is the survival of the fittest. It is the end justifies whatever means you want to use to get to the end that you desire. And at that point, long before Jesus had a chance to rehabilitate the golden rule, here's the golden rule. The one who has the gold makes the rules. But that's the way of life that has been established on earth at this point. I mean, everybody, to use the words of another TV show, everybody is breaking bad and going from bad to worse. I find it really interesting that today the folks who are taking the most serious, in-depth look, a dive into the depravity of the human heart, it's not Christians, it's not churches, it's the secular producers and artists are just saying, hey, we want to take a deep look at what has gone wrong. But by the end of Genesis 6, things have gone really, really disastrously wrong. Now, here's the key word. The word is sin. Last week, the key word was steward. For good leadership, the word is steward. A steward is a person who takes care of what has been entrusted to her or him. A steward is a person who nurtures, guards, protects, develops, advances, multiplies what has been entrusted. Good leadership is all about stewardship. It belongs to God. He's given it to us. We take care of it and we grow it. But in bad leadership, the key word is sin. And just like I said last week, leadership is this big word. So is the word sin. It is a thick word loaded with meaning. Radical evil in the ruined soul. That's what one author says. I love that language. I don't love it, but I'm moved by it. This thing called depravity. We are all broken bad. And you could go on and multiply 20, 30 different words for what sin has done to all of us, but what sin has done to leadership. And you might be thinking, well, Pastor Brian, that's just Old Testament kind of stuff. I mean, surely it gets better in the New Testament. You guys ever see the movie Zorro, the remakes where Anthony Hopkins is the old Zorro and Antonio Banderas is the new Zorro, but the new Zorro to be is really inept and incompetent. And so the old Zorro, Hopkins wants to do a little bit of assessing for what the potential new Zorro is like, and he does a little bit of testing and he just says, oh, this is going to take a long time. Every now and then, I just kind of envision Jesus looking at the mess the disciples make of things, and Jesus says, this is going to take a long, long time. So we have in the Gospel of Luke 3 like really short stories, and they're all put together, and I believe they were crafted together because we wanted to get a picture. So in Luke chapter 9, verse 46, an argument breaks out among the disciples about who's the greatest. I mean, it sounds like we're back on the school playground. No, I'm the greatest. No, I'm the greatest. No, I'm the greatest. And they're arguing about who's going to be the greatest. And Jesus winds up saying, listen, if you're arguing about who's going to be great, let me just make sure you all understand what great is all about. And he brings a child, and he says, listen, greatness is about being humble. Greatness is about lowering yourself. Greatness is about love. Greatness is about service. So if you want to be great, I don't have a problem with you being great. I just want to make sure you know what greatness really is. That's the first story. That's just, there's insecure ego issues going on for the disciples. The second story is this. Master, we saw somebody driving out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he's not one of us. Now, can you just imagine how ludicrous that is? Here's somebody who has the ability from God to deal with these demonic forces of darkness that are tormenting somebody's life, and the disciples are upset because that person isn't one of the gang. It's somebody else doing some really good work. And what makes this one even more interesting is just a couple verses later, there's a story in the same chapter where the chapter is all about the disciples cannot drive out the demon. And so you're thinking, gosh, we the group that's hanging out with Jesus, we can't do it. And there's somebody that he's in a different group and he's able to do it. And so the disciples are just like competitive and insecure with the outsiders who are better than they are. And Jesus says, listen, don't stop anybody from doing what is good. I mean, the kingdom of God is about as many people doing as much good as possible. Okay, now those are the two warm-up stories for the third one. And this is now, they're getting ready to head toward Jerusalem. And as they're going to Jerusalem, they have to go through Samaria. And I think you all remember the Jews and the Samaritans don't get along very well. And so they send word to this village and say, hey, we'd like to stop here for the night and hang out and get some good food and probably pulled pork. No, that won't be pulled pork. Sorry, wrong culture. Wrong culture. We're going to rest, we're going to relax, we're going to unwind before the next leg of the trip. And the people in Samaria say, no, you can't come here, you're Jews. And so James and John, they're called sons of thunder. They say to Jesus, Lord, would you like us to call down fire from heaven to destroy these Samaritans? They're not asking Jesus to call down fire. They want the privilege of being able to destroy their enemies. And what's so sad about this is just a couple of chapters earlier, Jesus told them how you deal with enemies. You love them. You forgive them. You pray for them. You go the extra mile for your enemies. You do as much good as you can for your enemies. And the disciples want to call fire down from heaven to destroy them just because they won't let them stay for the night. I mean, do you see just how broken bad these disciples are? And yeah, it's going to take Jesus 3 long years to begin to rehabilitate what bad leadership has done to those individuals. So yeah, it's not just an Old Testament thing. It's a New Testament thing. It's a life thing. C.S. Lewis gives me a real window to understand what's going on here. Lewis has this idea. It's striking to me. He says, the better, more beautiful, greater something was in its original condition, the higher it was, the more horrific its corruption. So he goes on and gives an illustration. Where do demons come from? Demons don't come from pigs. I'm on this pork thing this morning. Have you? Demons don't come from pigs. Demons come from angels. These beautiful, majestic, powerful beings, corrupted, become demonic. And the greatest devil of them all, we know as Satan. His name was once Lucifer. He was the morning star. He was the brightest of all created lights. He was the highest created being that God had made. And that person in his pride fell further than any. I mean, that's the greater something is, the more beautiful something is, the higher something is, the more horrific and tragic its corruption. And I think leadership, power and authority is one of those very great and beautiful gifts that God has created. Oh, it is so good. It is so very, very good. And oh, its corruption is horrific. Does that make sense? This helps me understand what's going on with this dynamic. Parker Palmer says a leader is a person who has an unusual degree of power to project on other people. Sometimes we hear leadership is influence. Okay, influence, project, leak onto other people, his or her shadow, his or her light. Leaders are those people with a great capacity to influence, imprint, leak, shape, mold, and we're going to do it with either shadows of darkness or we are going to wind up doing it with lights. Lord Acton had this very famous quote that oftentimes gets misquoted: power tends to corrupt. Okay, notice it's not power corrupts, it just has a tendency to corrupt, and absolute power will wind up having a tendency to do that absolutely. And then he goes on and says, great men are almost always bad men. Now, keep in mind, he is writing at a time in human history where democracy didn't exist, elections did not exist, just these great, powerful, usually men, took positions of power often by heredity. And Lord Acton, the British historian, as he is surveying human history, he comes to this conclusion: almost always people in those positions, they're not very good people. Now, George Bernard Shaw later on wound up saying, hey, it's not that power tends to corrupt, it's fools corrupt power. Unfortunately, a lot of fools seem to get their hands on a lot of power. Tolkien, the proper study of man is anything but man. That's a little reaction to a little poetry that was going around by Alexander Pope, where it says, presume not God to scan. Okay, get your eyes off of God. Presume not God to scan. Know thyself. Okay, the proper study of mankind is man. So here was a shift away from theology, a shift away from knowing God, a shift away from being connected to God. Let's get the shift off of God and get the shift onto man. Know then thyself, presume not God to scan. The proper study of mankind is man. Tolkien says, are you crazy? I mean, the proper study of man is anything but man. And the most improper job of any man is bossing other men. Again, by the way, he's writing a time when just, take the gender language into account for the history. Not one in a million is fit for bossing other people, and least of all those who seek the opportunity. Isn't that striking? I mean, like, the more you seek the opportunity to boss somebody, well, the less fit you are for that. Now, by the way, the more you take to cause conditions of flourishing for everybody, that's a whole different matter. But this is bad leadership. You just want to rule over other people. One ring to rule them all. That's the theme from The Lord of the Rings. Before we got to The Lord of the Rings, there was The Hobbit. Now, I know not all of you are as enthralled with fine literature as I am. But The Hobbit was a story of what greed does to the heart. The story of Hobbit is what lust for wealth does to the heart. The story of the Hobbit is what a dragon's treasure will do to corrupt even the bravest of hearts, whether they are dwarf, elven, or man. The only heart that isn't corrupted by the dragon's treasure is the heart of a hobbit, who only is concerned for love and friendship and probably a nice meal and a good cup of coffee or something else. And duty and honor and respect and dignity and back to love and friendship. That's all that's in a hobbit's heart. And so therefore, the dragon's treasure has no power over him, but everybody else it does. That's the story of the Hobbit. Well, now by the time we get to the Lord of the Rings, Tolkien has moved away from what money can do and to what power can do. And so the Lord of the Rings is all about this one ring of power that has been created to rule all the other powers. And this one ring, everybody is tempted by this one ring of power. Every major character in the Lord of the Rings is tempted by the law, the lure of this ring. And only a few had the ability to resist it. And the way they resist it is they flee from it, or they actually send it away so they won't even be tempted. Now, there's a scene that Peter Jackson does in the second movie, The Two Towers. It is simply masterful. The ring has come to a place where it is ruled by Lady Galadriel. She is one of the elven lords. And she is one of those people. She wants to save her people. She wants to save Middle-earth. And while she has power, she doesn't have enough power. And so she has greatly desired this ring. And Jackson just shows what the corrupting power of this ring, what it's doing to her. Let's just watch this clip. Right now, live at Living Word, we're showing a short clip from The Lord of the Rings, the second movie called The Two Towers. And in this scene, Frodo is in despair about the power of the One Ring. And he's also fearful about all the others who want to get the ring and use it for their own purposes. He trusts Galadriel and he offers it to her. She's one of the great elf lords who already possesses one of the 3 elven rings that she uses to protect Middle-earth. But she has greatly desired this one ring of power. Peter Jackson creates a masterful and terrible transformation of Galadriel. As she's reaching for the ring, she's rationalizing, she's deceiving herself. This one ring will make her beautiful and powerful beyond compare. Everybody will love her, worship her, and fear her. And then, the last moment, she's fighting the ring and she resists its temptation. She rejects the one ring of power and all that it offers, and she becomes herself once again. And she says, I passed the test, I will diminish, but I will remain Galadriel. There's so many nuances going on in that particular scene. She is being terribly tempted by the lure of infinite power, and she winds up knowing what it will do to her, and she says no. One ring to rule them all. I've never been tempted by the ring of power, but I did have my moment with the badge of power. I was in 6th grade. And I don't know if we can remember back to that previous era when they gave enormous power into the hand of 6th graders. It was called being a safety. And you would put on your little belt and you would have your badge, and that badge gave you the power and authority to allow students to cross the road or to make them stay where they were. And I was one of those with the badge of power, and I had the most important intersection. Right down there at Yorkshire Elementary School was the corner of 5th Avenue and Maywood Road. Not exactly a highway. But I was the one that I had to look both ways and make sure, and I had to get out there and I would just invite all the students to come across, and I was the power. Well, then there's this one day, there's this one boy, I don't know, 2nd grade, 3rd grade, he was running a little behind, and so everybody else had already gone, and he's there, and he wants to go across, and I said, no, you can't go across. And I look both ways, and there's no traffic, and I make him wait. Because I had the badge of power. And eventually I let him go. And I think nothing of it. The next day, I am called into the principal's office, Mr. King, the principal of Yorkshire Elementary School, and I found out that there's a power higher than my badge of power. It was Mom. The boy went home and complained to Mom, and Mom right away got on the phone, and she called up, and so there I am in Principal King's office, and he says, Brian, you abused your power, and we're going to court-martial you. You ever see those, those old, they're ripping off the signs of, I lost the badge of power. Never got it back. Okay, listen, that's a 6th grade boy. And it's a little comical and fun when it's at those levels. But you know, this thing called power just never goes away. It never stops tempting us. And when we get older, we just find other more significant ways that we misuse and abuse power. It just happens all of the time because power has this incredible lure and temptation to it. Winston Churchill, I'm going to, by the way, use a couple of British politicians so I don't wind up getting into trouble. I acquired power in ever-growing measure. I want them to feel my power. Oh, women, I don't want you to feel left out. I love ruling, said Margaret Thatcher. And oh, did she love ruling. And she did whatever she could to get as much power as she could. You know, if you want, sometime just go to the internet and Google quotes on power, and you'll find here's the top 10 quotes, here's the top 30 quotes. If you see the Goodreads quote, you'll see there's like 4,160 quotes on power. I'm sure there's a couple of duplicates, but there's quotes on power all over the place. I just pulled out a couple, and let me just read you a couple. Plato says, the measure of an individual is what she or he does with power. It is said that power corrupts, but actually it's more true that power attracts the corruptible, the sane, the healthy, the wise, the holy, the humble. They're usually attracted by things other than power. George Orwell, we know that no one ever seizes power with the intention of relinquishing it. And wasn't that some of the genius of our founding fathers? They set up a system where you had to relinquish your power. You couldn't keep it forever. George Washington actually was in a major situation where he could have kept power forever and started a new kingdom called the Kingdom of the United States of America. There would not have been a president, there would have been a new king, but he relinquished power. It was one of the most amazing relinquishments in human history. Leo Tolstoy, in order to obtain and hold power, a man or woman must love it, love the power. Kissinger, power is the ultimate aphrodisiac. Here's one author that says, power without compassion is the worst kind of evil there is. And one more, the great philosopher, author Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, don't trust an individual with more power than he has until he has learned how to use a little power better. Now listen to this. What a hell we should make of the world if we could do what we would. I mean, just individuals have thought long and hard about this thing called power. One of my favorites is very simply one of the best of us all. Nearly all people can stand adversity, Lincoln said, but if you want to test their character, give them power. Yep. You know, we can learn how to suffer, and we can suffer bravely and even heroically, but you know what? You really want to get tested, let's give you some power and see what you do with it. Now, I've been talking about power quite a bit because power is at the heart of bad leadership, but there's more things than just power that are involved with bad leadership. There's actually a cluster of things that are usually found in the lives of those people who are leading badly, who are doing some deadly things with their power. There's a cluster of things. And about a week or so ago, Brian Newman and I had a conversation about one of his mentors that helped him learn about this cluster of things that is seen in the lives of leaders who don't finish well. Let's watch this clip. Something that was really significant is you had a couple of major influences that you introduced me to, and I didn't know anything about those influences and some of their models.
Bobby Clinton was a big one for me, a Fuller professor, and he stood before us and he says, ladies and gentlemen, few leaders finish well. I want you to be one who finishes well.
Now, he also identified a lot of the reasons why they don't finish well. So there was money, sex, and power. What else?
And then there were a couple that kind of caught me off guard, and I think he was right on. One was about pride, inordinate pride. Another was when a leader stagnates, when they just stop learning. And then the last one was what he called sort of unaddressed psychological emotional dysfunction. Those 6 things were the big ones that cause leaders not to finish well.
Money, sex, power, pride, stagnation, and then these just psychological dynamics that are
unaddressed.
So, all right. So that was the content of the book, The Dark Side of Leadership, where those individuals came along and said there's 5 deep psychological dysfunctions that are pretty prevalent in leaders, and they do have to be uncovered and examined and healed.
And if they're not, they will destroy a leader's life and his or her leadership.
Yeah, so power is one thing, but there's a whole cluster of dynamics. And so let me just unpack in just a couple moments this thing called money, sex, and power, because it is so interesting to me that folks who get into positions of power, and the higher they get into a position of power, the more dangerous these issues of money and sex are. I did another Google search this week. I was just looking at what are the financial scandals that have rocked our world by people who were in positions of power. Let me just give you a couple. You're going to remember them from the news. A couple of these are some years back, but the American Insurance Group, AIG, and then there was Bernie Madoff, Enron, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Health South, the Lehman Brothers, MF Global, Questcom, Tyco International, World.com, and the list just goes on and on of individuals who were in great positions of power, and they had such abuse of the financial responsibilities that were given into them, and sometimes these amounted to the billions of dollars of financial misappropriations. And in many cases, these ripples went around and affected the entire world. They affected you and I. I mean, that's what happens when people get into positions of power and their hearts are not in the right place, and the next thing you know, they're making all kinds of bad decisions about money to horrible consequences. And then the same thing about sexuality. And I did a little bit of Googling, just looking at what have been some of the major sexual scandals. And oh my word, it's like there's no end to the articles that come up. And I'm not going to wind up mentioning names, but the whole Me Too movement is a response to the sexual abuse by individuals in power, whether those people are in Hollywood, whether they are in the sports world, whether they are on the prime TV channels, whether they are anchors, whether they are politicians, whether they are individuals in the church. I mean, there's just so many people in their positions of power. They use sexuality in unhealthy and even abusive ways, and people wind up getting hurt. And you could also wind up just going and looking for more issues about the abuse of power. And let me just give you one little illustration, because they're quite varied. But one is even the issue of Facebook and the Cambridge Analytics scandal that has gone on. Here's where an organization called Facebook has the power to gain a massive amount of data on you and I, and then they use that data they gained in unhealthy ways to make a profit. I mean, that's just the illustration of how all these things start to hang together. Now, pride is the mother lode out of which all the others get really, really dark. This narcissism, this hubris. You guys know I talk pretty often about Jim Collins and his good to great ideas. And one of the reasons I do is some people say, well, Collins is a business guy. Well, no, he's not a business guy. Collins says he's a greatness guy. He wants to see great churches. He wants to see great homes, great communities, great teams, great schools, great government, he just wants to see everything becoming as good as it can be for the flourishing of the world. So he just studies greatness. But he also realizes that a lot of people who get to those places, well, he wrote another book called How the Mighty Fall. And chapter number 1 is the danger of unrestricted pride and hubris. Is the reason. Then it just launches a whole domino of effects in. But why did the mighty fall? Is because of this unrestricted, unrestrained pride that takes place. And then to that, you add a couple of things like this stagnant, you're no longer learning, and some of these psychological dysfunctions. And the next thing you know, you've got leaders that are a wreck, and they are wrecking the world around them. Now, if last week good leadership was all about good leaders are those who lead so the people they love will flourish, and they do it with love and service, and they can do that because they're tapped into God, here's bad leadership. The purpose of the part of a bad leader is survive and advance of themselves at all costs and by any means. That's fundamentally the purpose for all bad leadership. They want to flourish. They don't care how many people they have to use so that they can flourish. And so therefore, what happens is they wind up playing these Game of Thrones, and they use others for their own purposes. They don't love others. That's what good leaders do. They love others. Bad leaders use others, because bad leaders basically love only themselves. And the source of all this, well, we call them counterfeit gods. Tim Keller has a great book out by that name. We call them the idols of the world. You get tapped into those things and they begin to remake you in their own image. I mean, this is the bad news of what sin has done to power, authority, and leadership. Now, in my last moment, let me just give you the good news. God is not letting it go unchecked. All through the Old Testament, God is at work to restrain bad leadership. God is at work to give guidelines for how you can overcome bad leadership. God sends these moral prophets to challenge those people who are in power. God has a passion for good leadership, and God is working. But he finally has to send his son, Jesus. Jesus is the game changer when it comes to power and authority. Jesus is the Game of Thrones changer when it comes to leadership. Jesus was the only one who relinquished the highest throne there was and came to earth to show you and I a better way. And the very first episode we have of Jesus going out into the wilderness is to what? Be tempted by this one called Satan. He was going to be tempted with power and authority and prestige and status and fame and glory and wealth. And he could do anything. And so he was for 40 days in the desert being tempted. And Jesus was the one who passed the temptation and was able to institute for you and I a whole new way.